Hey guys, how's it going? Jay Sensational here. Welcome back to another video where today we'll be covering 8 different decks that have sort of evolved throughout the patch and is kind of where the meta is heading. And I think that you'll see a very common trend within some of these decks. But just a general overall of where the meta has been shifting a lot in the earlier portions of the expansion. There's a lot more aggro, but as we progress, we got a lot more of these more board based decks, and those decks are generally pretty good into aggro because they are able to chump down all of the other board but have a better sort of win condition. And as aggro sort of shifted away from the meta, we have entered this really big mid-range sort of meta where a lot of stuff on board really matters, a lot of tempo matters, a lot of these decks have a lot of combat tricks to keep their board alive. And here are some of the decks that I think have been performing quite well as a result of the shifting meta, and I think are a good spot for this week and maybe the next week to come, even maybe up until the expansion, or not the expansion, but the patch, and then the champion rework coming in April. So more news on that later on. But let's just jump right into it and look at some 8 new decks, not new, but 8 decks that are performing quite well within the expansion as of this week. So starting with our first deck we have here, it's Draven Rumble. There's also the Draven Silent iterations that I think are performing quite well as well. But the importance of this sort of style of deck is it's just a little bit faster than sort of the more Demacia-based mid-range decks. Having the ability to dictate trades with cards like the Flame Chompers off the Boom Baboon allows you to push a lot of early damage, combined with cards like the Reborn Grenadier, getting that early chip damage in. You have cards like Might as well on cards like Rumble. If you chip it in a lot of damage on turns 5 to 6, you just have enough burn in your deck to finish off your opponent. This deck specializes in, again, just going a little bit faster than the other mid-range decks, as well as having the burn to back up their game plan. A lot of other decks right now rely on cards like rallies and things like that are a lot more board dependent, because if you don't have a board, then your rallies don't really work. But this deck in particular just aims to race down your opponent. You really want to get in that big damage on those turns 5 to 6 turns. Even, turns 2 to 3, you have a Risen, right? You have a Draven into like a Flame Chompers with an Axe. You're pushing 8 damage already. Decimate, Get Excited, Mystic Shot, great ways to close the game, and Portal Cannon just out there to block some of the more elusive based decks. So very strong performer in overall meta, has seen a recent shift back in because, again, one of the reasons why we have this very prevalent mid-range meta is because a lot of the Ionia based decks, the Kennen Ari and the Zoe Lee Sin, are really nowhere to be seen on ladder. And so a lot of these mid-range decks gotta thrive because there is a distinct lack of that sort of counteraction for the decks that they're normally bad into. But moving on to the second deck. Next, we have Scouts. This list hasn't really changed very much since I previewed it in the first video of the meta, and rightfully so. I think Scouts is, again, very dominantly strong. It's just so powerful in what it does, especially with the card Durant Sculpture, this being a 2/2 that you play on 2, and that really demands you to remove it on curve. If your deck fails to remove this, suddenly every other unit that they play having 1 extra health just makes their deck 10 times harder to deal with, especially because they do have cards like Ranger's Resolve and Sharpsight as well. It doesn't seem very impactful, but when you're starting to play like a 3 mana 3/5 or a 3 mana 3/4 Misfortune or like a 3/6 Quinn, these are very impactful differences. Quinn getting buffed from a 3/4 to 3/5 may seem very small, but it actually had a pretty major impact in how powerful Quinn was, how reliable it was to get those scout attacks off, and now having the Durant Sculptor as well, being able to compound that health total across all of your units is really insane. The overall just general ways of being able to protect MF, you have the Ranger's Resolve, you have the Sharpsight, you have the Durant Sculptor, and you have plenty of scouts to really threaten an MF level up really quickly. Especially if MF starts off with 4 health, it becomes extremely difficult to kill. And it just closes games by itself when MF levels up. It's just really insane how powerful of a card it is. And for the late game, we have cards like Sithir as well as Genevieve, some very well-statted units being able to buff up your board, to up trade across the rest of it, is very strong, again, because we are in a so dominated mid-range board-based meta. So No surprise that Scouts has remained one of the most played decks on ladder, as well as the highest played or highest win rate deck on ladder as well. So very, very dominant. You could run some other cards if you really want to protect MF, but cards like Shield of Duran I think are just a tad bit slow, and just really not necessary as long as you're able to skip or stick a Durant Sculptor onto the board. Onto the third deck, we have a more of a Rico Rec special. This is a classic Freljord Damas or Freljord Noxus Overwhelm list. It features cards like Darius, Iron Ballista, Fallen Reckoner, and even like one of Farron. Um, the reason why this deck is pretty powerful is because it is just a big, well-statted deck. Cards like Troll Chant are just super, super impactful in, again, these board-based metas, because this card being able to trade up for 2 of your opponent's units is extremely powerful in maintaining tempo as well as board advantage. Because we have big units like Darius, the Ancient Yetis, the Wild Claws, these can often or not double trade up against your opponent's units as well. And Whirling Death in this big boy unit deck is extremely powerful as well, being able to act as like a 3-mana removal card, almost comparative to like basically a Vengeance per se, although albeit it can get interacted with, of course. If both decks are playing all units, Whirling Death is a really, really big game changer that can often not just decide tempo swings and everything by itself. Of course, with an Overwhelm deck, we have Battle Fury just being able to close out the games and being able to apply a lot of pressure. When we're all playing on board again, you have no removal for a card like Battle Fury. You don't have Vengeance, you don't have Hush. You're playing cards like Pokey Stick, maybe like a Buster Shot. Deal 1, deal 3. You have no way of stopping a Battle Fury, and this card can often not just dominate games by itself. Next up, we do have some of the more standard Demacia decks, this one featuring Panth Taric. Again, a very good deck because of how big and how how its units can scale over time. Cards like Saga Seeker and Wounded White Flame, as well as Pantheon with their faded keyword, allows you to scale up your units, make sure that your opponent can't get value trades into your own units, and you can slowly snowball an advantage through. An issue with some of the more board-based decks is that they really can't punch through because they don't really have many keywords on their units. And Zenith Blade is the perfect sort of counter to that problem that a lot of these board-based decks have. Zenith Blade giving your units Overwhelm, especially units that can scale up to 8, 9, 10 attack, gives you an incredible amount of pressure that you can apply to your opponent. So being able to attach a Zenith Blade onto Wounded White Flame, not only does that give a Wounded White Flame 3 health because of the Faded as well as the 2 from the Zenith, it also gives the Overwhelm keyword. So now your opponent is either not blocking your unit to not give you a free trade as well as a Fury proc, but even if they do, now you're still chipping damage through. Combined with Taric to give you a lot of card draw through combining it with cards like Pale Cascade, Guiding Touch, or even like a Rally is just an extremely well positioned way to close out the game. And with Demacia, you also have some very nice removal options, such as cards like Single Combat as well as Concerted Strike. Confront being a very nice also addition to this sort of faded archetype, because not only does it proc faded, it also allows you to dictate where you want the trades to go, allowing you to get some good value trades in, and overall just snowball your advantage again. Next up, we have another deck that has been played a lot in recent tournaments, and now has been shifting a little bit more into the ladder meta as well. This is Akshan Sivir. What's really, I guess, not much. There's not much new with this sort of archetype, but the archetypes overall, especially into these Demacia mid-range decks, have generally benefited from the same new cards, especially the addition of Petricide Broadwing. This card is just so integral in what this mid-range Demacia wants to be doing. A 2-mana 3/3 challenger, it's so hard to beat. You have cards like Bright Sail Protector to protect it. You have cards like Shapestone Sharpsight to give it extra health to chump or to eat up bigger units. I've seen some lists play the Shield of Duran, which I think makes a little bit more sense in this sort of deck. I think overall is still a little bit too slow. You could slot it in, and I think it does fine. But again, just this general sort of Demacia style deck, you have a lot of ways of applying pressure. Sivir alone is just a really big 5 attack unit that heads in on turn 4. You have the Treasure Seeker, the Waking Sands off of that. Merciless Hunter being a fearsome, also super relevant, and of course, Vanguard Sergeant, one of the most insane powerhouses in all of mid-range Demacia. when you have a board, when you play for Demacia, suddenly your board just trades down all of your opponent's board, and once they have no board, you level Sivir, the game's just gonna be over in your next attack turn. I think one cool addition to this archetype that I've seen some of my friends be playing is Sithria the Bold in this deck. Now, instead of Sithria the Bold, in the past it might have been like 2 Radiant Guardians, but as aggro has been shifting out of the meta, Sithria the Bold is sort of a very good answer with this deck against a lot of these Banner City decks where they don't really have good fearsome attackers or fearsome blockers. And so being able to play a Sithria is sort of like an extra Absolver Sivir combo where your opponent really can't block and you're able to push lethal damage through. So, a very good meta decision depending on how much aggro, how much burn you see. Now, of course, if you are playing burn, you might want to go back to the Radiant Guardians. But if you're seeing a lot of Banner City, or like Sithria the Bold just to give all of your board fearsome, is a really good way of pushing damage through Banner City. And now we're shifting to some of the more decks that have sort of come out of the meta because they're pretty good into these mid-range decks overall. The first deck we have here is Cait Ezreal. Although I myself prefer more of the Draven Ezreal versions because they can play a little bit better for tempo. This is the list that was popularized by somebody that hit Masters early on in the season, and I think a lot of people have generally gravitated towards this list. Overall, I'm not the biggest fan of some of the card choices here, but I do want to showcase it because I think it's still backed up on ladder by its decent performance, and I think it has a good amount of games to at least solidify it as a decent deck. The reason why this sort of deck is so powerful in this current meta is it has a lot of well-statted and cheap removal options. We have cards like Ravenous Flock. This is like the main card that makes and breaks this sort of archetype in this sort of meta. A 1 mana deal 4, or just pretty much say kill a unit, is so insanely powerful, especially when we have such synergistic ways of proccing it. We have the traps off of Caitlyn and Piltover Peacemaker. We have the stun off Arachnoid Sentry. We have cards like Mystic Shot as well, Static Shock, to be able to really reliably and easily proc Ravenous Flock. That makes it such a huge threat to the opponent's board states. The second card is Tribeam Improbulator. If you guys haven't seen this card in the meta recently, the card reads deal 1 to a unit, summon a 1-drop, and for every 3-drop you play, this scales up. So eventually it becomes like a 5 mana deal 6, summon a 6-drop. And if we're all very board dependent, we're so focused on tempo, you can see how dealing 6 to a unit and summoning a 6-drop of your own is just such an insane tempo swing, especially for a spell. It's just so insane that, we actually run 19 3-drops in order to reliably scale this quickly in the game. Now, again, another good addition to this deck that does make it very powerful is its ability to run extra burn. So cards like Captain Farron not only bringing an 8 overwhelm, but generating 8 damage in burn, alongside cards like Mystic Shot, just give us another over the top if we need it. And of course, we do have Ezreal for that burn as well. So we're able to stall out the game, wipe out our opponent's tempo, and then play Captain Farron, whereas, it's like the Overwhelm deck. A lot of decks right now just don't have an answer to an 8/8 Overwhelm, and this will chip in like 6 damage, and then you have Burn to finish the top with the game. Other cards like Scorched Earth and Noxian Guillotine, very good into sort of the bigger decks like the Pantheon deck, as well as having a good answer against some of the tree decks as well. The next deck has a very common theme to the Cait Draven deck, or the Cait Ezreal deck. This is Gnar Swain. This is a list that Blue God played to hit rank 1 on NA. This is a list that I used to hit Masters this season. And for the same reasons that as Caitlyn is strong, Gnar Swain has a very similar package. We have the Ravenous Flock, we have the Scorched Earth, but instead of the Piltover removal, we have the Banner City side of things, which not only allows us access to very easy pings, such as cards like Poison Dart and Pokesick. We also have cards like Oncologist to give us extra spells, being very flexible and finding what we need in certain situations. So you can find extra pings, you can find extra Culling Strikes, you can find extra Scorch Earths, whatever it may be, very situational, but always a good choice. Cards like Loping Telescope and Banner City Mare just allowing us again to get that flexibility. Maybe we want an Equinox, maybe we want a Moonglow, maybe we can get like an Aloof Traveler. It's just very situational cards that makes it very flexible no matter what sort of deck we play against. As long as there isn't a prevalence of burn or aggro in the meta, this can just really snowball again, having the Swain level up stun the opponent's boards very cheaply is also a very good way of applying pressure as well to the opponent. Vandal City also has the an added benefit of being able to run Mini Morph as an extra burst speed single target removal option that a lot of decks lack, and Gnar's addition in this deck also sort of fits that build, being able to give opponent's unit vulnerable, as well as giving yourself a 6/5 quick attack, just to really challenge it and gain a valuable tempo trade there. The last deck I do want to talk about is Darkness. Now, Darkness does struggle a little bit more into these big aggro or big Demacia decks, but I want to talk about a little bit of how Darkness has sort of evolved to really wrap around the meta, because I do think this is really interesting. This is a list popularized by Cephalopod, a very strong player in the North America region, and he was really tinkering with the deck from the old, and this is what the new version looks like. You'll see 3 copies of Wallop, 1 Transposition, and 2 Piercing Darkness in this list. And this is the main change. It doesn't seem very impactful, but this is just a really big it's a really big change to sort of answer this meta, and I think it's a very smart um, choice of cards put into the deck. Wallop being a very cheap interaction, being able to stun a unit, say it's like a Captain Farron, say it's like a Pantheon, say it's like just a scout unit off of Misfortune or off the Scout's deck. I'm just very good at slowing down your opponent's game plan. It could be like a challenger onto Vagar, it could be anything really. This card is just so powerful, and it's found a home in this sort of deck, and I think it's really, really powerful. Piercing Darkness is very good into decks like Scouts, just needing that hard removal. You have 2 Piercings, 3 Vengeances. You need to be able to remove the Misfortune. You need to be able to remove the Pantheon, the Lulu, the Yumi, whatever it may be. Just having a better single target removal that isn't necessarily Darkness, because if your Darkness is stuck at 2 damage, or even like 3, it doesn't really reliably remove the key targets you need. The rest of this deck has a lot of pings, but having the extra sort of single target removal is very powerful in this sort of deck as well. Overall, Darkness is the most played deck. It doesn't really have that many counters. Obviously, the decks like Pantheon, Scouts, Sivir Akshan do pretty well into Darkness. But outside of those decks and Tree, Darkness really does have that many counters to it. And Darkness overall is the most played deck in the meta. Rightfully so, it's just very, very powerful, very flexible in the hands of a good player, because it does run the Vandal City cards as well. But this will be the last deck to wrap up the 8 decks that have sort of sprung out of this mid-range meta. If you guys are following along, this is where I think the meta is shifting towards, and if it continues in this direction, I see some fringe Ione decks coming back. Lee Sin has sort of been on the edge. Its win rate isn't great, but if we see a lot more of this Demacia stuff, I expect Lee Sin to be coming back as well. So we'll see. The meta is still shifting quite rapidly. Well, it'll be really interesting to see where it goes, especially as we head into the patch. But for now, here's what I think is doing well. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys saw a deck that you might want to try out yourself. So if you guys enjoyed the video, please do leave a like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys tomorrow with another video. Peace out, and take care, guys.